Good evening, everyone. My name is Melissa Nobles, and I'm the Dean of the School of Humanities, Arts, and Social Sciences. And it gives me a great pleasure to welcome you here to this event, Writing for a Wider Audience. This is something that we did about 3 years ago, I think, in 2014. And we thought something happened in November, some election thing. And while this has always been important for our school, and for our school in particular, SHAS, but also for the Institute, to think about getting our word out to the wider world. I can think of no time really, at least in our nation's current moments, when a panel like this seems even more important. So it was with great pleasure that when Emily and I met with Jill earlier this spring, we thought, let's try to have this sooner rather than later in order to marshal our energies and to get us thinking about how we can affect a social and political and economic environment about which we are all concerned. So we are very pleased to be co-sponsoring this with the Boston-based Needham and Williams Literary Agency. So I'm going to introduce Jill, who in turn will begin, the program will proceed accordingly. So Jill Needham is the co-founder of Needham and Williams, and she's been an agent for 27 years after a previous career as a publisher and editor. She represents best-selling novelists and journalists and has made a specialty of bringing academic writers to a broader audience, a broader readership. She has had 3 nonfiction Pulitzer Prize winners in the past 11 years, and all 3 of them have been academics. So that's a great record. So with that, Jill, very much appreciate your being here. Thank you for organizing this terrific panel with us, and I look forward to the event.
What a pleasure. Lucy Cleland and I work at Needham and Williams, and we are looking for. Oh, okay. Can you hear me? Is the microphone on? Hello. Yeah. Okay. So we are literary agents, Lucy and I. We hope that there are dozens of writers that we'll be representing soon in this group, and we're thrilled to have gathered a group of publishing and writing professionals who know how to write for a wider audience. So Lucy is going to MC this occasion. I'm going to turn it over to her, but we're very grateful to be having this chance to have a platform at MIT, your wonderful school.
Thank you guys for having us. So I'm going to take a minute to introduce the panel and talk about the format of the panel, which is a little bit unusual. We're not going to kind of do the question down the line thing. We're lucky enough to have 2 book editors, one of whom is also a book publicist, and 2 journalism editors who are also both journalists, and 2 agents. So we thought we'd kind of do a 2-by-2 pair-off and let us each talk from our corner of the industry, kind of as a team, about our perspective on it from that corner. So tonight we have with us Dante Ramos, who is an editor of the Boston Globe's Ideas section, and he also writes a column for the Globe's Opinion section. He's contributed to The Economist, The New York Times, The New Republic, and was a Pulitzer Prize finalist in editorial writing in 2014. Next to him is Gareth Cook, a Pulitzer Prize-winning magazine journalist and contributing writer to the New York Times Magazine. His writing has appeared in Wired, Scientific American, The Washington Monthly, the Boston Globe Ideas section, and on thenewyorker.com. He is also the editor of Scientific American's Mind Matters psychology blog. And down from him, we have Matt Weiland, who is a vice president and senior editor at W.W. Norton Company, also just known as Norton. He has worked at Ecco Books, Granta Books, and Columbia University Press, as well as on the Paris Review, Granta, and the Baffler. His writing has appeared in the New York Times Book Review, the Washington Post, New York Magazine, The Nation, The New Republic, Bookforum, Slate, and he's the co-editor with Sean Wilsey of the best-selling State by State, A Panoramic Portrait of America, 2008. Matt, that sounds kind of like something we need again. And with Thomas Frank of the best-selling Commodify Your Dissent in 1997. And down from him, we have Lissa Warren, who's vice president and senior director of publicity and an acquiring editor at Boston's own Da Capo Press, which is an imprint of Perseus Books now owned by Hachette. She is the author of The Savvy Author's Guide to Book Publicity, a comprehensive resource from building the buzz to pitching the press, 2004, and teaches graduate courses on book publishing, editing, and publicity at Emerson College. So it's a great panel. I think we're going to start off with Gareth and Dante to tell us a little bit about what writing for a wider audience means from their perspective.
All right. Well, thank you very much. People often ask me about writing, and I often start with this. When I'm writing, I often imagine myself sitting on a bus next to someone and telling them a story. And I feel like a lot of things about writing flow from just that simple thing. First of all, when you're talking to someone, you have to be mindful of what they might know and what they might not know. So you can't get, I often write about scientific topics, you can't get too technical. I mean, if you're sitting on the bus there, you have to bear in mind, what are they going to know? What kind of background are they going to need to know to make sense of it? The next thing that sort of comes from that for me is thinking about what they're going to find interesting, not what you're interested in necessarily, but what is someone, just you're sitting next to one of us, what are they going to find interesting about what you have to say? Are there things in their life that you might be able to connect to, experiences that they've had that you might be able to connect to? And the other thing that I think is really central to being a writer and a successful writer is to always remember it's not about you. You're trying to tell someone else a story. You're not trying to show off. It's not a sort of a performance art. So it's important to always think of that reader right in front of you. And when you sort of imagine that, you will sense when their interest is waning. So that's thing number one. The second sort of most basic thing I would say is story. Can you tell a story? Can you tell me something where something happens and the next thing happens, and the next thing happens, and you want to know how it's going to turn out? Are there characters in your story that someone's going to care about? So I did a story for the New York Times Magazine that was a profile, actually, of a scientist at MIT named Sebastian Sung. He's since moved on, but he was at MIT, and he was a neuroscientist. And his field is the connectome, which is how all the neurons connect in your mind, in your brain, and how this may encode memories and thinking. So this is a pretty sort of technical and abstract topic. So the first thing I would do is think, well, how might I connect this with the average reader? What might they be interested in? So for example, you're probably interested in memories. You're probably interested in identity. You can't really be yourself without memory. But then also I looked for ways of telling stories. And one of the stories I told in this magazine article was there was this woman in Norway, Anna Bagenholm, in 1999, who was skiing. She was skiing down. It was sort of the spring day. And her foot got caught on this rock, and she spun around and was going down head first and landed, and she went through the ice in this river and got trapped underneath the ice. So her friends rush down and try to help her, but they're not able to pull her out of the ice. So eventually her heart stops. They call for a rescue, and it takes an hour for the helicopter to get there. So the helicopter lands. At this point, this woman is clinically dead, and she's flown back to this hospital. But sort of miraculously, they're able to bring her back to life, and she was pretty much, after a month, as good as new. So at one point, she was effectively dead. There was hardly any activity in her mind, but her whole identity had been preserved just in the physical structure of her brain. So that was an example of a story that I would tell in a magazine article to try to draw people in and get them to understand what I'm talking about. So I think I'll stop there and let you talk a little bit.
Well, hi. Thanks for having me here. I do not have any life or death stories in what I'm about to say. Actually, this is, to the extent that Gareth and I are doing a good cop, bad cop routine. I guess I'm kind of the bad cop. I edit the Boston Globe's ideas section as Gareth has. I have also been an editor on the op-ed page. And I guess I would say, in terms of defining the universe of the types of writing that we're talking about, there's obviously a wide range of things that you can do to reach a general audience. It can be something as expansive as a book. It can be something as story-driven as a piece in the New York Times Magazine. A sort of more modest way that people first find their way to a new audience is through an op-ed page, through a magazine, through a shorter magazine article, through a newsier type of article. And I guess that's the type of piece that I like to talk about, just because it is such a thing that is such an elementary thing that people find themselves doing first as they try to expand beyond academic or beyond scientific material. I think, in my own observation, different people in different occupations bring different occupational hazards to the kind of writing that they do. When we have reporters who come out of the newsroom and try to write opinion pieces or analytical pieces, you sometimes end up getting a, just the facts, Joe Friday type of presentation, because you have people who, from the beginnings of their training, it's been drummed into them, don't have an opinion, do not insert yourself too deeply into the piece. And that can disserve the writer like that who tries to move on to something else. Similarly, I've run pieces or edited pieces before from nonprofit executives who, will say, oh, well, let me just show this to 6 other people before I show it to you. And I'm like, no, show it to me first. Because you show it to the other people and they'll sand off all of the interesting edges of the piece. And I don't want you to do that. With academics and with scientists in particular, I think the occupational hazard is that everything in your training tells you to not speculate about things that are beyond your immediate sphere of research, and do not generalize about things that you know kind of specifically, and stay in your own lane. And I guess I would sort of discourage you from doing that. Recently, I published a piece, and it was an opinion piece from somebody, a young public health scientist, who had been visited sort of weirdly by the Silicon Valley, I don't even know what you call it. It's almost like a kind of biotech incubator thing. And the person was sort of dressed in a hoodie with the shirt neck open, and wasn't really an expert in the field, and was supposed to be there getting their ideas about how to expand biotech, and just wasn't really all that knowledgeable in the field. And she was sort of enraged by this, and this person was an infectious diseases expert and wanted to write about that experience. And thinking about it, you think about all the aspects of our lives that have been disrupted by Silicon Valley, and there are people from taxi drivers to pizza delivery people to journalists whose lives have been disrupted in that way, and there's something really deeply universal in that story. That was what interested us in the piece. When she was writing on it, falling back upon her public health training, she was wary of saying, well, all I know is about infectious diseases, so I'm not qualified to speculate wildly about how Silicon Valley might have affected other people. And it's like, no, really, please generalize irresponsibly, or at least go out on a limb. And I think that's something that academic training, you're sort of taught to be more careful. And I don't know that as a journalist, I want to tell people to be less careful, but I do want to tell you to be less careful. Similarly, in academia, often you are writing for an audience of people who are peers in your field, people with similar expertise, people who read the same journals and are sort of looking at problems the same way that you do. Almost by definition, when you're writing for a general audience, you're writing for people, a sort of random collection of people out there who might pick up your book, or might pick up your story, or might pick up your op-ed piece, and know nothing about the subject at hand. And you should not feel ashamed about trying to, in fact, you shouldn't feel ashamed about it. You should actively try to sell the importance of your subject to the general reader, because if you don't, the inherent interest of it won't necessarily be obvious to the reader in the general audience. I published a piece once from someone who's an expert about Latin America, and there's a sort of paragraph, if you're writing for a journalistic audience, you expect people to say, okay, this is why it matters to Americans. And this writer was like, well, no, that sort of cheapens the subject, and people should be interested in this on their own terms. And I said, you're absolutely right. If in a fair world that would totally be true. Also, we need the paragraph about why this matters to Americans. So anyway, all of this is just by way of saying I'll see the microphone, but I guess I would just urge people to understand the differences between your audience in an academic setting and a general setting, and not, they're just two different arts, and don't be ashamed of recognizing those differences. Thank you.
So now we're going to move over to the world of books. Thank you, guys, for giving us a view of the journalist's world. As literary agents, we are in the position usually of being the first people in the business that you as an author will deal with. And our job is to help get you ready to present your work to the daunting publishers who make very, swift judgments. So Lucy and I were talking about how we could usefully divide our remarks here. And I just want to talk briefly about how, if you're thinking of writing a book, you may be well into it, and I hope you are, but if you're still thinking about it, we think that possibly, this may seem obvious, but the most important thing you can do is pick a subject that is broadly interesting. How are you going to pick a subject? You can't write a book on a slice through. And Dante, this is in many ways the kind of thing you were talking about. But we often hope to hear from people in your world earlier than you imagine, because we hope to have some usefulness in saying this could be a lot more interesting to that man on the bus if you did this or that. If you started with a story about a woman skiing who fell upside down into a frozen brook, or if you don't make every chapter a technical chapter about whatever you know. And I know most of you in this school are not writing about physics and biology. You're writing about history and sociology, and we're fascinated. So pick a good subject that you think will be of interest, a way into it that will be of interest to that man on the bus. And it isn't just a story. That is, you can't write a book about the woman who was skiing and fell into the stream, I think. You want to write a broader book, but you can use her to your great advantage. And then you have to write a great proposal.
Yeah, and the proposal is something that I think agents know a lot about, and it's tricky. It's an assemblage of things. As many of you may know, some things that go into a proposal are an overview of your material, a chapter outline, a sample chapter, various other extras like a section on comparable titles and about the author, these kinds of things. But really, we see it as a blueprint for the book, especially in nonfiction, and an incredibly useful sales tool in that way. And you may think that the most important part is the kind of siren song at the beginning, the part that reads like an op-ed, but it might come as a surprise that that's the part we often ask people to write last, because Jill and I strongly believe that the backbone of any good proposal is the chapter outline. Because if you don't know where the book is going, then you can't really, put on the movie trailer version of it. You have to know where the argument is, how the narrative runs. And we have a lot of fun building that out with authors, and it's part of the hardest parts of writing for a wider audience, I think, is realizing that it's not just about how you write, it's about how you write it, as in how you frame it out and structure it, and how the reader is invited to move through the material with you as a guide. And I think Dante especially made a great point talking about, not being afraid to generalize a little bit more and put yourself out there in that way, which we are telling academics all the time on our end, writing, coaching people through proposals for trade, because it's so important that the reader trust you and trust what you're having to say. So if you lay the facts out there for them to interpret, some of them definitely will. We believe in readers that way. But I think, some may get angry halfway through and throw your book against a wall. And so, it's so crucial, and when writing a proposal, to feel like there's someone at the helm of this ship And once you've mapped out where you're going to go with it in the chapter outline, it just, things snap into place, and we see academic writers, reborn with this new sense of confidence, which they use to come back and write, the very kind of sexy siren song at the beginning. And the first page does have to kill. Don't get us wrong. It is very important. But it's so great when it is married with a really strong foundation and structure. Yeah. Of course.
I always hope that one of these editors to our right, getting your proposal from us, will be thinking like this. They'll read the opening section and say, wow, this is really very, very interesting. But she'll never pull it off. It's too hard. And then we'll read the chapter outline, and we'll start saying, this is pretty good. And reading a little more, the chapter outline say, this is actually very good, and finish it by saying, where's the phone? So now on to what the editors think of these proposals of yours that they receive.
So when I think about writing for a wider audience, one of the things that I think about always is the need to be adept at speaking about complex topics in layperson's terms. Sounds so very easy, but is actually so very difficult. But there's more. You also need to have a personality that comes through on the page. And I think that people who are writing about scientific topics, economics, math, whatever it might be, tend to think that personality should not be a part of their proposal, should not be a part of their manuscript in their book. I feel quite differently. I'll give you a good example. We are the publisher of Brian Cox, who you may know from his Discover Channel television series, BBC, British theoretical physicist, smart as the devil, works at CERN on the side. And he wrote 2 books for us, and during the publication of the first one, he just kind of casually mentioned that he was in a rock band. And I thought, as a publicist, I can work with that. Here's somebody who's smart as whip, but has a life, has a personality, and will be happy to go on radio shows and television shows talking about his book, but will field a question about what it's like to be in D-Ream, his band. And then he also casually mentioned during the promotional process that he was voted one of People magazine's sexiest men alive. And I was like, yeah, right, Brian, you're cute, but that's funny. And he's like, no, really, I'll scan it for you. I'll send it to you. And he did, and sure enough, he had been voted one of People magazine's sexiest men alive. Now, I'm not telling all of you need to go out and be voted one of People magazine's sexiest people alive, but it just showed that there was more there than just a physicist. He could talk about physics till the cows come home and was amazing at it. But there was personality, and you know what? That personality comes through on the page. He's not afraid to use contractions. He's not afraid to use slang. And he knows that the ideas in his book are unique enough and concise enough and well thought out enough that he can have some of that personality. It's almost like the more you know about your topic, the more personality you can allow to shine through in your book. And it's a really compelling thing for readers. Another thing that to me is very important when it comes to writing for a wider audience is having a platform of some sort. When we are at our editorial board meetings, we can have a book that's a great idea, a proposal that's a wonderful idea, but if the author doesn't have some way of helping us get the word out about the book, the sad truth is it's probably dead in the water in this day and age. Now, that doesn't mean you have to be tweeting your fool head off and have, 1 million Twitter followers. It doesn't mean you have to be on Instagram. It doesn't mean you have to be on Facebook. But you know what? None of those things hurt. And I'd be lying if I said that we didn't check people's social media numbers before we make them an offer. And if we see that somebody has 100,000 Twitter followers and we see that somebody else has 1,000 Twitter followers, well, we know it's going to be an uphill battle to get the word out about that book written by the author who doesn't have as much of a social media following. So part of being a mind in the public sphere is communicating in the way that the public is communicating these days, and that means social media too. My students at Emerson, they read almost exclusively ebooks, no printed books, and they spend a whole lot of time on social media. And they get all of their recommendations for what to read via social media. Doesn't mean they're not reading Proust. Some of them are, but they're hearing about it on Facebook and Twitter. So use social media and think about your platform. Your platform is also writing op-ed pieces. That's an extremely helpful thing to do. And writing articles for magazines and articles for newspapers. Anything that gets your name out there matters to us. We take notice of that. Last thing I wanted to mention is giving public talks. That's a huge, huge part of writing for a wider audience, because if you are giving talks to people and you're seeing what's resonating, what isn't during those talks, what kind of questions you're getting after your talk is completed, you will have a really good idea of what you need to cover in your book, what resonates with people. I encourage authors to try to get a lecture agent just as soon as they are able to, and they're hard to get sometimes until a book is out. But when we get a proposal from an author who already has a lecture agent, we know that there are going to be opportunities for back-of-the-room sales at any talks that that author gives. We also know that it probably means the author is going to travel to various cities to give talks, and we can try to arrange local media and bookstore events for them in those markets while they're there. That makes a big difference to us, too. That can be just the thing we need to kind of throw us over the edge as to whether we're going to make an offer on that book. A good example of that is a guy named David Wallman, who did a book for us called The End of Money. It's all about how cash is becoming a thing of the past, but not just for credit cards, for things like Bitcoin and Square. He wrote this great proposal, and we were all like, God, this is great, but how are we going to get the word out about this? What are we going to do? And he said, well, I do about 20 talks a year. And we thought, well, that's interesting, to local libraries, who is it? And he said, oh, no, like American Express and MasterCard. And we thought, I'm thinking they probably have money to buy books and give to their employees. They won't even have to sell them in the back of the room. And sure enough, some of those, special sales did come through. So publishing is a business. We look for great authors with great ideas. We look for great authors who can express those great ideas in wonderful, exciting, personality-filled ways. But we're also thinking, nuts and bolts, how are we going to let people know that this book exists? So that's platform, that's speaking, it's getting out of your comfort zone and getting off your couch and getting out there, getting out of your pajamas too, which seems to be what authors spend a lot of time in. They're working alone in a room for a very long time. You have to do the opposite of that when you're out there promoting a book, so we need people with the personality to carry that off too.
You're getting good suggestions, good tips throughout. I'm Matt Weiland. Thank you to Jill and Lucy and to Dean Nobles. I'm very excited to be at MIT, an institution I revere. I partly because I revere expertise, partly because I don't have any. I'm in, I think it's my 27th year in book publishing, and I still know very little about most things, but I know a little bit about just about everything, which is one of the joys of my work. And one of the reasons I find it so exciting to work with scholars, with academics. I come from an academic household and grew up in it, though I have no advanced education myself. In my view, that's what publishing books is, both for an editor and for readers. It's a way to keep learning and to keep engaged with parts of the world that just are compelling, are fascinating. And so I think I take it as well, as a book editor, I always feel like a bit of a therapist and a tailor and a bank teller at times. But more than anything, work as a book editor is work as a talent spotter. And I don't have any particular tricks about that, other than to say that I follow what happens in the academic world very closely, in the hopes of finding something that, if not it's the sort of thing that I want to talk to somebody on a bus about, is the kind of thing I want to talk to somebody in a bar about, or hear from somebody in a bar. That's the great ideal to me, is that kind of informality but seriousness and depth and passion. We talk to our friends or loved ones or family over a drink or over a meal about something that engages our interest and our fascination. That's what leads to great books. I think it's really important to remember when we see the bestseller lists and the lists of prizes every year, how strange most books are, how oftentimes the subject matter for the books that sell, the books that people love, the books that people talk about, and that live for ages are about subjects that you would never imagine, you would never expect. And what, after all, is, scholarship at its best than chasing after unlikely subjects that, might not seem the thing one would, monetize or think has the most value superficially. So more than anything, I would encourage you to be bold. We need strange books, unlikely books, unusual books, books about subjects that people have forgotten are interesting or didn't even know mattered. But that's what engages readers. I think it's all too easy to be downhearted about the state of book publishing and reading. Ignore all that. Book publishing is strong in whatever form. And there are many, many editors at all kinds of firms looking for good stuff, fresh stuff, original stuff. So more than anything, I think it's important that we don't, censor ourselves or think that only, what someone else might deem as commercial, which is a word that is more or less meaningless, matters. It's what people like you are doing alone for hours, thinking that no one else might care, is what I think book publishing really does best, focuses on best. We need a prod now and again and some encouragement. Along with being bold, I'm talking here about choosing a subject and creating a book. We can talk a little bit more about crafting the book, which is what I love to do best. But to stick on the question of choosing a book and a subject, I think it's it's important to remember that books come in all shapes and sizes. A book is a strange form. I work with a lot of reporters as well as academics, and even the best of them, I think, are surprised at just how enormous a book can feel when you're in it, how hard it is to, you just feel lost, and it's just got so much room. But the same thing goes for an editor and for readers, and that's the glory of it. And so one thing to remember when you're thinking about what might make a good book is that it needn't take the same shape as the research or the scholarship or the work one does and one presents for funding or for in whatever form, journals or books for a scholarly audience. It could just be one part of that work that could engage an audience in a new way. I don't pretend to have a guideline to what that is, but I think we know it when we talk to a friend or someone close to us and see in their reaction their surprise and their excitement. That, after all, is what is the kernel of one's own work, right? The interest that one feels about. I may not even know why it's so interesting, and I think it's really important to chase that, to cling to that, to champion that. Maybe I'll leave it there, and we'll talk more about craft in
Thank
Q&A.
you,
Yeah.
Matt. Yeah, that was wonderful. So before we move on, we're kind of going to move in two stages to Q&A, but I just wanted to open up to the panelists and say, do any of you guys have anything, responses, questions to ask each other based on what people said?
That was a surprise that you asked us that, Lucy.
It was.
I think that, having...
Speak in the microphone.
Thank you, Joe. Thank you. I think the fact that we have two amazing journalists on the panel shows you that it's not all about books. And we mine newspapers, we mine magazines, we mine smart websites for talent. So a big part of, getting the interest of a literary agent might very well be reaching out to a piece that you see in a newspaper or magazine. And I guess I'm wondering for Gareth and Dante, what it is that sparks your interest, that makes you think, I've got something here when something crosses your desk? Is it the person's credentials, or is it their writing style, or the topic, or what is it that matters most?
I think what's been interesting to me about all these comments is that sort of at every phase of the process, and for every type of writing, from the smallest little bit of it to the longest book, I think a lot of the same advice applies. Your credentials are helpful because it helps the editor know that you're knowledgeable about your subject if you're writing within your subject. Your personality matters because the editor needs to know that you can sort of project beyond the immediate confines of what you know. Your social media presence is increasingly helpful also, in the sense that if you are active on Twitter or in various other places, we are more likely to have seen your name to begin with. And, even at a basic level in a newspaper, somebody who has 100,000 Twitter followers will probably get more clicks on the piece than someone who isn't active on the medium at all. And that, again, none of that decides everything, but it's all helpful. I mean, I think probably in all of our cases, there is a basic judgment that you have to make about whether it's something, do you want to read it? Have you read it before? And is this person who's proposing it the person to write it? I guess I'd also say that our job as editors is, there's a sort of gatekeeping function that I think can be overstated. Our job is also, as I think some others have said, to find new talent and find new voices and bring them in and have them say new things that readers haven't read before. I guess our request from you would be that you make it as easy as possible for us to sort of make that translation.
Just to answer your question of how I can tell if something's a good story, I would say it's literally a feeling. Like, as soon as I hear about something, I'm like, oh man, that is awesome. What? I get excited. And so I've learned, it's weird, the more experience that I've had as a journalist, the more I've learned to just follow that feeling of just being excited about something. And you have to sort of step back from that and decide whether your excitement is going to translate into a story for other people, but that's kind of the first thing. And you can make a lot of mistakes kind of talking yourself into a topic, like you're not actually excited about it, but you think it's important or you think you should do it, and that's always a mistake. And I feel like you can get a lot out of just that core feeling of excitement about a topic. The other thing I wanted to pick up on something Dante was saying is that in all forms of writing, there's this crucial relationship with the editor. And a lot of writing is really a partnership between you and your agent, and then between you and an editor. And you need to understand and respect that, because I feel like the people who end up being most successful are the ones who are good at working with editors. They know how to listen to criticism. They know how to get the messages that the editor is giving them, because the editor is the first person sort of outside of yourself reacting to the material. So they can sort of stand in for the reader and tell you whether or not people are likely to respond to these stories that you want to tell. And so that's another thing that I think is just really crucial in all kinds of writing is that connection with an editor.
I think that it's useful in a way to point out that this mysterious reader out there that you might be trying to think up a story for is actually you. And that you just have to imagine yourself out of your specialty and into any other specialty and imagine an idea that would appeal to you. What causes you in this crazy, overcommitted world to pick out even an article to read? And something about the way that works is exactly what makes your work for other people like you. Are we going to turn?
Yeah, I think we're going to turn to Q&A, and you're going to introduce two of our people in the audience.
The ringers. We have two ringers here. We should have probably had a longer table because it seems like first of all, I'm sure that a number of you in this room already know what it's like to write a book. We happen to have made special contact with two fantastic writers of trade books who've written a number of books who come from among your ranks. So one is Deborah Blum, who's running the Night Science Journalism project here, which was started by Victor McElhenney, who is also here. And so Deborah is a Pulitzer Prize winning science writer and has written 5 popular science books. A number of you may actually have read one or more of them. They include The Monkey Wars, The Poisoner's Handbook, and Sex on the Brain. You can see these are good subjects to grab people. And she's getting ready to publish her next book, which is about food safety, which is a subject that cuts close for all of us. And we have as well Tom Levinson, another person on the MIT podium in a way, who is a professor of science writing here, and who has written, as Deborah has, many articles published in many outlets. Perhaps one of you has edited one of their pieces. Tom has published 4 books. 5. Yeah. Whoa, gosh. Okay, 5 and 5. We have 10 books here in the front row, including Einstein in Berlin, Newton and the Counterfeiter. What's the 5th book, Tom?
Hunt for Vulcan.
Hunt for Vulcan. And he's also a highly experienced and award-winning maker of documentaries, mostly for PBS. And we just wondered if you two, you don't have to make some kind of speech, but since we want to hear from all of you, authors and would-be authors, we thought it might grease the way to hear from 2 authors who are extremely experienced and know exactly what it's like to suffer through the difficulties of publishing a book with a trade book publisher. Tell us.
Deborah and I were fighting as to who would go first, and I lost. She is the most dangerous person on the internet. Never sit next to her in a old-fashioned drugstore. She can kill you. I guess I had several thoughts and a couple of tips. The basic tips based on what the panelists said are ask to read when you're talking to an agent, either selecting one or working with one. Ask to read what they think are exemplary proposals. Just learn what the people you're dealing with believe is the way this should be done, how they, what represents work and so forth and so on. And similarly, when you're thinking about a book or an article, in a form or a genre you haven't done before, this is, it's bluntly obvious, but it gets forgotten a lot, which is just read things you love in the form you would like to write, as far away from your own work as possible. I tend to read a lot of literary criticism when I'm thinking up a new book because I have no desire to write any literary criticism, but the form of that work seems to really stimulate my own brain to compose a proposal and hone my ideas. And the other thing I would say very quickly, and this is really, I want to sort of throw this back as a question to the panel. I've come to be increasingly suspicious of the use of the word story as an exhortation to myself or would-be authors. Because I think for nonfiction, I'm finding more and more what we really are writing is argument in narrative form. And I think the emphasis on story gets you lots of proposals and some books that maybe shouldn't have been books, which are compelling on the level of anecdote, maybe even extended anecdote. I mean, Gareth's wonderful story about the woman head down in a stream is an utterly compelling, story in a bar. You'd listen to it over a beer, but it's only when you make the connection to some really complicated ideas, not narrative, not plot-based work, about the physicality of mind. And you have, and so I guess, without being too contrarian, I sort of wonder if people can drill down a little bit more sort of behind the story to what they expect for a compelling piece of nonfiction from an expert audience, an expert writer speaking to a lay audience.
I agree with that wholeheartedly. I think storytelling is one of the most useless cliches and exhortations of our time. I think you said it just right. I think story is useful when it engages a reader, but it can feel like a 2-bit screenplay when there's just too much of it. And I think too many people who have great expertise, reporters, writers of all stripes, academics, are encouraged to turn everything into story. And that's just that's not. I think that's very poor advice, and it leads to very unappealing books. I think the trick with with great and lasting trade books is the blend of, like it's like a meal of any kind, right? You need different textures, different colors, different kinds of nutrients to feed the body, just as in a book you need these different textures to feed the mind. And ideally, story is yoked to argument and to example and to particularly, I publish a lot of books in science, and I often have writers worried that the science, is there too much science? And I just think, well, sure, it can be difficult, but be generous to your readers. Like, readers can go much deeper about most things than I think people expect. Now, that's a tough trick. That's an art to it, but again, be bold about it. Go beyond, I think, where we expect most readers to be, and we'll be much better off. I think story, again, there's no perfect measure to it, but I often, will scrawl rudely in the margins of manuscripts that I'm working on, all right, you hooked me, I'm in, but now give me something that is deeper, more interesting, more lasting than just anecdote or narrative.
I think sort of to marry that, to me, the story is merely the vehicle to convey the idea. It still needs to be a cracking good read, a really good story, but if you don't have those groundbreaking ideas, those counterintuitive ideas, those fresh ways of looking at things that we all thought we already knew everything about, the story doesn't matter. It's just entertainment, and there are lots of other forms of entertainment out there.
I want to speak up in defense of the story, which is getting kicked around here, because I doubt that anyone in this room is in danger of writing a book that's nothing but a story, frankly. I myself am addicted to books about big ideas, and there's just nothing more exciting than a thinker who takes you into a set of big ideas. But unless you've got that lady on skis falling into the stream, that is a way. It's somehow the human mind is made to think in stories. So it's a way to hold on to so much of what it goes on to say. So I'm sure you didn't think that we were all going to throw out stories, but.
And you remembered it, You remember the story about the woman falling, which Gareth was the first person to speak, But I think that's interesting, that's, part of what came up in this question and what we were all touching on. I think storytelling, it's one of those things that it's empty until you put something in it. And I think as a sales tool, on our end of the spectrum, it can be incredibly important. Because often the expanded elevator pitch is all we have time to show an editor. But as far as holding up a whole nonfiction book, go ahead. You look like you want to say something.
No.
I was just going to say, this poor woman, she skied into this lake 5 times now from the course of our conversation. I think I have less experience than anyone at this table at sort of handling story-driven fiction, and virtually, or most of what I deal with is driven by argumentation. I mean, I think, if by story we're also talking about, this sort of pleasant translation of idea A to idea B to idea C, there's sort of elements of storytelling, even something that is devoid of anecdote, still has to have a certain element of storytelling to it. I guess the one other thing I would say is that, in terms of deploying story, real life often, especially if you're writing about a big idea and using the story as a way to get there, sometimes the real life anecdote and the, does not quite capture the thing that you're getting to all that neatly, and you sometimes do read things where it feels like the writer is really putting their thumb on the scale pretty hard, so it just seems as though the selection of anecdote is sort of important to whether the story works or not, because there's lots of ways for it to go wrong.
Just to add one other thing, this may be a little bit redundant, but I think that one of the things that good writing has for me is it's constantly changing, it's constantly moving. So there are times when the voice is kind of a storytelling narrative voice, and if it stays in that voice, the writing overall can have this kind of stasis to it. So a lot of times when I'm doing magazine writing or other writing, there'll be storytelling, and then all of a sudden it's much more exciting to get explanation because you've just been hearing this one kind of voice. And then after explanation, you're more prepared or excited for argument woven into it. So there's this feeling of the writing and the way the writing is being conveyed is moving. And that sort of sense of movement, I feel like, is a very essential part of good writing. Sometimes it's just a sheer sense of movement that comes from good narrative, but it also can come from this shifting of perspective and voice and how you're trying to connect with readers.
That's a crucial point, and that's partly what I mean by the varied textures, and that's also what yields the feeling in great trade books, at least in my view, of three-dimensionality, of a richness that it just feels very large. It feels symphonic, and that has to do not just with characterization and narrative, but those shifting textures that allow you to live inside the book as a reader.
Yeah, and I think that's part of what we were talking about with the proposal too, but we think that's a tool that often helps writers find that varied texture and that voice. It can take you from an op-ed that might be, touching on 2 of those voices and then add a deeper level of expertise or story or argument into it.
So, Deborah, I know you've got something to say. It might not be on story, but wanted to maybe hear a new element coming in.
Sure, I have a couple. I'm going to face this way, just because I'm more comfortable actually looking at the people I'm talking to. If you guys don't mind, I'll kind of back in this corner. So I wanted to react to a couple of things that were said and then give you a couple of thoughts of my own about writing books and then see what you guys had to say. First of all, anyone who writes a book is going to go through a series, I think, of love-hate relationships. You're going to have a love-hate relationship with the book, and you're going to have a love-hate relationship with your editor. We're talking about loving your editor. I'm an author. I'm doing my 3rd book for Penguin Random House, and with the same editor at an imprint, Penguin Press. And the first 2 books that I did, one was the ghost book we were talking about, and the other was Poisoner's Handbook. She, kind of stepped back and said, go do your thing. The book I'm working on now, she is really interested in, and it's so annoying to me. I mean, she's so opinionated about what this book should be, and I'm just thinking, couldn't you lose interest in me again so I can go back to doing whatever I want to do with the book, and then you come in later and say, fine, it's just going to the production editor. So just be aware that there's going to be a tension between you and your editor, and that's okay. And there's going to be a tension between you and the book, because sometimes books are the best thing in the world and they sing to you, and sometimes you just think you're never going to get out of this one part of it, and you just have to hold on to the idea that you will, and you have to be really determined, right? You love the idea, will carry you forward, and love the idea enough to, stick with it, will carry you forward. The last book I did, which was Poisoner's Handbook, which was for me a commercial success. I actually have no idea how many copies it sold, but I'm in royalty. I'm actually in actual royalty payments. It was a PBS documentary. It, has been optioned for a television show. I mean, for me, it's been a successful book that sold somewhere over 100,000 copies, which to me is a successful book. But the thing was, with that book, it took me 10 years to talk my agent into actually letting me sell that book. And finally, I whined about it so ceaselessly. I had done the previous 4 books, and she just said, okay, right, if I can just get you to quit going on and on and on about this book, write the proposal and we'll try to sell the book, right? So it's worth it if you love an idea not to give up on it, right? And sometimes you'll want to even look for another agent. I've had the same one since 1992, so, thick and thin. But I want to say that. So here's a couple of pieces of advice that have at least gotten me through some of this. And I'm going to go back. One of is this. When you're writing a book that's a big idea, it's very helpful to have a one-sentence idea of what that idea is. And I learned this early on. What's the idea that my book turns around? Because if you can crystallize that down to something very simple, then your complicated structure and storytelling will turn around it. And just to give you a quick example of that, the first book I did, which was on primate research, which was the work that was the Pulitzer Prize winning work for me, I had this one sentence in my mind, which is animal research is about us. And that's the idea that whole book turns around, and every chapter in that book is about a scientist making a decision, right? A decision about the fate of an animal, a decision about the fate of a project, right? And all of it turned around the one sentence. And you'll find that useful later, which is where I'm segueing, when you go out and promote your book. And I know that promoting a book just sounds like a real pain in the ass, right? And I have to tell you guys, I hate that 100,000 following on Twitter, right? I'm sitting there, I'm literally saying to myself, damn it, I only have about 30,000. I'm a total failure, right? And so there's no magic number for Twitter following. If you don't have tens of thousands of Twitter followers, there's lots of ways to make a noise. Don't make yourself nuts, right? You'll figure out a strategy to tell your story. I think the most important thing there is to say, to think about the audience you want to reach. And for me, it's what I think of as the audience that's not at the campfire, right? I'm not interested in telling my stories to people who are already standing around the campfire of science. I'm a science writer. It's the people who've turned away, who are out in the shadows, who don't think science is important, that really matters to me, and that will drive me. How do I reach them? And if you think about who your audience is, then you'll figure out, I think, your promotion strategy, right? It's very targeted. I want that big audience because I want what I do to make a difference. And so it's worth it to me to put the time into doing it. And if it's helpful to you, at the Night Science Journalism Program, we do a lot of this craft. Jill has been one of our speakers, right? We do a lot of talking about how this works. We bring in a lot of authors. We actually had an anthropology professor who's been coming regularly to our meeting and hired our fact checker for her book, right? So you just also remember that there's a lot of friends out there who can help you. They're here at MIT. And that you want to look for a group that will read your book before your editor. That's the other thing that I wanted to say, that as a writer, it's very useful to me quite often if I take my manuscript to some of my friends first and say, what do you think? And does this work? No? And you don't do that? I do.
Depends on your friends.
Yeah, it does depend on your friends, but it's helpful to have someone who can just read it as a general reader and say, this worked, this didn't work. And it's helpful. I have a friend who records all her books and then just listens to herself reading them so that you can hear the rhythm of the story. Because going back to story has a rhythm, right? And it's going to be very helpful to you if you think about the rhythm of the way you want to tell the story. So that, and finally, just have fun, right? You're going to hold on to that because you're going to need it, right? I wonder if I said anything that anyone here thinks is wrong. And what I wanted to bring to you was going back to the promotion idea, because it used to be back in the story days, if you were an author and your publisher was really invested in your book, you would get a book tour, and there would be a publicist dedicated to you who would do a lot of the work that authors do now. And my impression, and anyone here can correct me, is that's shifted, the burden of that has shifted hugely to the author, and that publishers look to us now to do a large amount of the promotion. And I wonder if you could talk some about what drives that change, and if there are ways that if you ever see that changing again.
I think of it as a partnership. I
Okay.
really do. And I think that the best houses have a publicist who will be assigned to your book, and they will work very hard on your book's behalf, getting traditional media for it, lining up events, whether it is a national book tour or whether it is just some key independent bookstores in your area. But we do look to our authors to do certain things that are beyond the scope of what we as in-house publicists are able to do. That would include arranging lectures for yourself with the help of a lecture agent or just through your own professional network. You're all affiliated with MIT, that gives you a great in here, but no doubt there are other wonderful academic institutions where you will have, fellow students who go on to teach, and, those connections. We rely on our authors to mine their connections, more so than we used to, perhaps. I think some of that is just due to the number of books that are being published every year and the number of books that every in-house publicist has to work on. It's just a reality. But I always say to my authors, if they feel like they're not getting enough attention, not getting enough love, and don't have the time themselves because of their own careers or their own writing schedule to really put a lot of muscle into it, you can always hire a freelance publicist. And the best thing to do in that case is ask your in-house publicist for a recommendation of someone who has gotten results for them in the past. And that's something that they'll be amenable to if you come to them and ask them about it. Don't just go out and hire one without speaking with them, because they'll feel like they got fired and they'll wonder what they did wrong, and that will demotivate them to work on your book still. But if it's a combined, let's put our brains together and find the right person and figure out how we can divvy up the labor, that can be quite a good thing for a book. But you're right, it is more work than it was when I started in this business 22 years ago. We used to do all of it in-house somehow. And now we're going to our authors and saying, how can we be partners? What can you do? What can I do? It's different now.
So we're just going to open it up to general questions now. And do you still have the mic? Is it around? Okay, great. We do want the questions to be mic'd, so raise your hand and ask for the mic. Okay, looks like we have one here, and then you in the back.
Hi, I'm Kiran Setia. I'm in philosophy at MIT, and some of your advice is coming too late because I last year wrote a book, trade book, that's coming out in October, which I'm very excited about.
Congrats.
It's called Midlife, a Philosophical Guide, and it's supposed to be a self-help book. And I'm now entering this completely uncharted territory of thinking about publicity and promotion. And so I wanted to follow up on the conversation that was just happening about what are the most important things that I should focus on doing. Is NPR the kind of primary thing to focus on getting on, or should I be thinking about writing op-eds or magazine articles in connection with it, or blogs, or all of the above? I should say I'm not one of People's 50 Sexiest Men of the Year, and I believe I have 40.
There's still
Sorry, not
time.
yet.
I would honestly rather have NPR's Fresh Air than People Magazine's
That's better.
Sexiest Man Alive when it comes
Okay.
to book sales.
And I have 41 Twitter followers, all of whom I will, fully exploit. But I'm not a big social media person, so I'm sort of thinking, what are if you could tell me what the sort of top few things I should really work at doing, what would they be?
Well, your in-house publicist or a freelance publicist who you hire should pitch you to NPR, both national shows and major market shows. There's Leonard Lovehate on WNYC. There's Forum on KQED in San Francisco. Those are like gold for people in publishing. I mean, we see the Amazon numbers go in the right direction when we have a national NPR hit. So that is crucial. Op-eds are still wonderful. Deborah, I remember an op-ed you did for the LA Times for Love at Goon Park, your wonderful book on Harry Harlow. I was Deborah's publicist, and it was one of the proudest things I ever got to do in my career so far. It's true. Thank you. It's a heartbreaking book, but it's beautiful too. And I remember Deborah wrote an op-ed for the LA Times, and I just took that link when they put it online, and I just sent it to radio producers and other people who I thought should know about the book and should read the book, and she kind of did it better than I could in any pitch in that op-ed piece. So writing op-eds would be a really great thing to do for your book, and I feel like op-ed editors are really good about letting authors mention the book in their little bio line at the bottom. So I think that's a very worthwhile thing to do. And then bookstore events, especially independent bookstores for smart books. You can knock yourself out with your Barnes & Noble if you want to, but it probably isn't going to do for you what a Harvard bookstore would do, or a Politics and Prose in DC, or Powell's in Portland, or Elliott Bay in Seattle. A good publicist would be able to guide you and pitch you. And you shouldn't have to do the pitching of yourself. It's gross. It feels awful, right? Who wants to have to do that? But you'll have an in-house publicist, and you'll have a freelance publicist if you need to. Who are you publishing with, may I ask? Oh, you'll be fine. You'll be in good shape. They're great. That's good.
My name is Malik Gotch. I'm teaching the history faculty here. I just wanted to ask our book editors how or if at all do you use outside readers on a book manuscript? Do you ever send a manuscript out to a reader for purposes other than the blurb? And if you do, then how do you decide how to do that?
That's a good question. No, we don't. I started out at Columbia University Press when I began working in publishing, and of course that's the norm in university press publishing. In trade publishing, at least my own view, is that no other expert opinion is necessary for the acquisitions process, but our own. And in terms of editing the book, I love working on books about subjects that I don't know anything about, and so I don't want someone else weighing in. I don't want an expert to say yet what's missing. That does come later. I work in a lot of history and science, and I often, at a later point in the process, before a book is set up and typed, will either ask people who I hope will give us a blurb, or friends and colleagues of the author, to go through it in a way that I wouldn't, I might miss. But no, I want to work on it from the perspective of that mythical beast, the general interest reader, of which I believe there are very, very many. I think it's important, particularly for scholarship and for work in history and in science, and especially in sociology and ethnography. These are things which have an effect, which make a difference to how we see our country and the world. And I view it as my task to approach that writing, with the question of, am I convinced? Can I follow the writer? So I make a point. In fact, I'll ask the writer often, as was said before, I don't want other people weighing in at that early stage. I want to just see it raw, generally.
I just wanted to pick up on one thing he's saying here, which I think is really important, which is that if your editor is completely ignorant about your topic, that is the best thing ever. It's just like, I'm serious. It's like, that is like the curse when you're writing a topic that you know really well, is that you've lost perspective on it. And what you most need is someone who doesn't know about it. And so it's just a different model. And like, if you go to someone who's worked on history books before but doesn't know anything about your topic, they're going to be able to see connections. They're going to be able to tell you what they're responding to, what they're getting excited about. They're going to be able to ask questions that are so basic that other people in your field might ask, that will lead you to really think and be able to connect with readers. So this sort of like ignorance of the outside editor is just, that's what you actually want in that process.
I often have these long back and forth in the point at which an author switches from love to hate with me, I think, where I'll say, but does everybody know this? Because this is so interesting. And they'll say, oh, yeah, everybody knows that. And I'll think, yeah, but I don't know that. And I was talking about it with my wife, and she didn't know that. And my son certainly doesn't know it. And my colleagues didn't know it. And I think this is a really important fact of publishing. Publishing, means to make public, after all. And I think if we take for granted that, everybody knows that about things in our own field, we miss out on the fact that actually a vast part of the reading public doesn't know most things. Now, you can make mistakes on that front, and I take it as part of my task is to make sure I don't bend too far the other way, and allow a writer to belabor the obvious or to present as though no one ever knew something that has been written about a lot. But no, I think that's a really important part of it. And just as you expect your editor, to not know things that's important as a writer, I feel, particularly for those who have great expertise, to allow themselves to be a little ignorant, in writing, to sort of drop down to explain in a way. And that's oftentimes what I'll write on manuscripts is like, just slow down here. Tell me more about this. Explain this a little more slowly, as though you didn't already know it so well that you didn't feel the need to explain it.
Michel de Graaf, I'm a linguist, and I'd like to follow up on Malik's question. I think there's a subtext here that I think we should explore, which goes back to a point that Melissa made about the climate we're living in, which is there's so much fake news. So how are you editors screening fake science? Because if one is writing about a scientific topic, and if the book is being edited by someone who doesn't know anything about the topic, then how do you make sure that what you're publishing is actually accurate, actually can help the average reader understand the topic, which might be quite complex? So I'll take an example, actually, from the New York Times. So the New York Times once published an article about Creole languages, which I'm from Haiti. I speak a Creole language, which is Haitian Creole. That article in the New York Times called Creole languages born-again languages. And the author, actually a linguist, John McWhorter, was comparing Creole languages to prehistoric languages. The claim was that by looking at the Creole, you could actually see what language looked like from the dawn of humanity. So basically, I, as a Creole speaker, when I speak a Creole language, I go back to being an early Homo sapiens. So that's ridiculous, but yet it was in the New York Times. So I think that I want to take that issue to heart. So I think that editors, should look closely at the science behind what's being published. Otherwise, it's going to reinforce the very concern that Melissa started with, which is we need good knowledge to reach average readers, so that we prevent more fake science, people making the judgments based on erroneous claims. So I think there's an issue there for you to look very closely. So what's your responsibility in terms of accurate science?
So I'm not the book editor, but I'll just take a first swing at this, which is that it's not really the book editor's job to do peer review, and it's just not practical. I mean, that's one practical So one practical answer is that it's not possible for someone in these positions to go through and check everything in a book to see whether or not it's accurate. And in fact, it's the author's responsibility to ensure that everything is accurate. But the next thing I would say is that when editors, I think, are looking for an author, they're looking for someone who is trustworthy. And so part of what they're thinking about is who is this person and what gives them a position in which they can talk about this topic. So that doesn't mean that there's not going to be mistakes or the author may have erroneous opinions, but it's not the same as sort of an academic book which goes through at this sort of separate level of review. So fake news is something that I, as a journalist, care passionately about, and it's very upsetting. In fact, tomorrow I'm giving a talk at my son's high school about how to tell the difference between fake news and real news. So like I care about this topic a lot. To me, the distinction I would draw is between fake news and journalism is not something that's incorrect. Fake news to me is not something that's incorrect. Fake news is something that pretends to be a product of journalism or scholarship, but is not. It's just someone sort of typing. as opposed to doing something. So journalists make mistakes. I've made mistakes. I have all sorts of corrections on things that I've done. But that doesn't mean that what I was doing was not journalism or fake news. So I would also draw a distinction between reading something in a newspaper, which is incorrect. There are things that are incorrect in every newspaper every day, and sort of putting it in this category of being fake news. So to me, fake news, if that were fake news, that would be someone who didn't know anything about this topic, had made no effort to see if what they said was true, and was just sort of writing something. So that may be kind of a fine distinction, but that's kind of how I think about it. So I'm also not a book editor, so someone else might be able to answer this better.
About a book review. It was about a science article in the New York Times. It was in the science section.
Yep.
And so it was not a book review. So I would have hoped that the author of that article would have done some background check on what was being claimed about a whole set of languages. And it's a topic that I take very seriously.
Yeah. So it's just, so I write for the New York Times, but it's sort of hard for me to answer like such a specific question about that instance, because if it was by a journalist at the New York Times and it was a mistake, then it should be corrected. If it's by someone else and they're expressing an opinion or a theory, and some people support that theory but not you, then that's kind of fair game. And I mean, you know so much more about this than I do. I can't really sort of give you a good answer.
There is another and much longer conversation about the ways bad journalism as opposed to fake journalism happens. And I think that's sort of, we're talking about whether or not this was an instance of bad journalism. But what I wanted to say was, first of all, in the three types of media we've been talking primarily about here, newspaper or other sort of daily journalism, magazine writing, and book writing, there is no formal fact-checking process that is conventionally applied to newspaper journalism or to book writing. There is a specific, the famous New Yorker fact checkers. When I wrote my first book, it was very unusual, which was 1989, which is a long time, it published in 89. So back in the Stone Age, when we were still working with chisels, it was unusual for writers, at least all the writers I knew writing our first books, to look for an outside fact checker. But now Deb and I are both members of a writing sort of listserv, and amongst the 20 or so writers on that list, all science writers, it's pretty much standard practice now when we work on a book to hire a second fact checker. The House won't do it for all the reasons that have been said, I try to be as meticulous as possible, and their mistakes slip in, and it's just impossible on the scale of a book to keep the mistakes down to a minimum without having a second pair of actually trained and fact checking is a specific skill, and to finish off this long-winded thing, which is budget $5,000 or more to hire somebody between the final edited manuscript and before it goes into galleys, so you can get your corrections in on time.
So we're going to take one more question. I see a hand in the back, and there will be time to mingle with all the panelists afterwards and ask individual questions. Actually, I believe it was the man in the back. I apologize. Okay, you want to wait? Maybe we can do both.
Well, I'll be quick. So my name's Catherine Clark. I'm on the faculty in Global Studies and Languages here, and I'm very used to explaining why France matters, for example. But I wonder if we could back up just a little bit. So I'm wondering about how you go about just pitching ideas. So do you read things that are cold pitched to you? I mean, is the best way to pitch an idea to kind of milk every single contact you have who may have ever published anything before you to get an introduction to an agent or to an editor? Or do you all have time to read things from people you've never necessarily heard of before?
Do both. That's the short answer, is work all your connections at the same time. But yeah, we do have time to read stuff cold. We read, I think, gosh, I have a list going of everything we've read this year. I think it's like 1,000 projects long. That's a lot of letters, but we get to them, and it's not always Jill who gets to them first. Sometimes it's me, and there's a screening process involved. So if you can find someone who knows her instead and get to her that way, it's always helpful. I think networking is just a part of the process, especially when you're trying to reach agents who are, frankly, chintzy with our time because it's what we value. And we have to spend time on what we consider valuable, and you kind of have to have some proof of that in advance.
Yeah, I think anyone who is able to say, I teach at MIT, is certainly going to get my attention. And then the idea has to be interesting and so on. But I think it's very exciting to get something that says, I teach at MIT, and I have this interesting idea. Here it is. Are you interested in talking about it? And it might be off base for me or Lucy, or it might be something we want to have a meeting with you about. But don't get discouraged about that stage. I think, we give out a sheet once in a while that essentially says you want to find out who are some good agents to approach. Go look in books that feel like yours. Look in the acknowledgments and see if they say thanks to an agent, and you'll get a list of agents that way. And then, agents get a lot of queries, 30, 40 a day are coming in, and they're trying to work for the people they already represent. So the more focused and what you have to say is, probably the better. We're only human, just like you, so whatever gets your attention gets ours.
And I will say that most book editors do rely on literary agents as sort of the first line of defense, the people who separate the wheat from the chaff for us. But the first book I ever signed was a guy I met in a bar. Not like that. It was for a literary magazine, and he was talking about some time that he spent as a monk in Thailand, and it was just a great story. And I said, do you have a proposal? And he said, what's a proposal? And I said, I'm going to send you a proposal. Do that with your story, your idea, and send it back to me. And, about a year later, we had a book that was on shelves. So it can happen. Network, don't devalue networking. But if you're really serious about being a published author, you really do need to find a good literary agent.
Apparently more time in bars and on buses.
There's that.
The 3 Bs. Did you want to say something?
Yeah, I would just say, I don't know if any part of your question had to do with publishing in newspapers or magazines. I would urge you to, if you're pitching to a publication, be fairly confident, or be fairly confident that you know what they publish. Read other stuff. You would think that issue arises more often than you think. I get a lot of pitches. I'm sure when Gareth was sitting in the chair that I now sit in, that he got a lot of the same pitches, and some of them are great, and they're from people who know the section well and know exactly what we want. I mean, we got a pitch the other day that came off the transom and rate it right into the paper. It was phenomenal. That often doesn't happen because people will pitch things to the Globe that might be better for Scientific American or might be better for some other publication. And if you're sending the same pitch to everybody, that's not super helpful. And we know when the font is different, where it says "Dear Dante" as opposed to the body of the thing, and then it says "So Gareth" at the bottom of the thing. This is why I want you to publish it. No, don't do that.
Yeah, I think that's super true on the agency side as well. If you don't even BCC everyone that you've sent this to, we can see everyone else you sent it to. But the word that keeps coming to my mind here is kind of couture. There's a tailoring process that I think you have to go through with your ideas, and then when approaching people about your ideas. And it's specific to every book, every idea, every article, but it's also a lot of fun.
So let's drink and eat. and gossip.